Hi everyone, we're going to go ahead and begin today. My name is Emily Cohen and I am the program coordinator here at Faith Trust Institute. We are here for the presentation on military sexual assault, the role of the chaplain. And we are joined today by Reverend Dr. Kristen Leslie of Eden Theological Seminary, along with Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune here at Faith Trust Institute. Marie will go ahead and begin our time together in just a moment, but first I just want to go over a couple details about how everything will work today. So first of all, you should be seeing me on your screen and hearing me through your computer speakers. If you are having any problems, I'm going to put this in the chat box so that we can troubleshoot once we get going, but go ahead and just send me a chat message, and then once we get started, I can help you sort that out. Regarding the panel on the right side of your screen, there should be a questions box, and that's what you're going to be using to ask questions of our presenters today. We plan to have some time at the end of the presentation, and we ask that you just go ahead and send in questions at any point, and then we'll hold on to them until the time comes. The slides that you'll be seeing on your screen today will be emailed to you later this afternoon so that you can refer back to the information that's presented today. So you can look for that email later on from me this afternoon. And if any additional resources come up during the presentation, I'll go ahead and add those as well. Lastly, we're recording this webinar for those who can't join us for this live session, and it'll be available on our website, faithtrustinstitute.org, soon for listening afterwards. Just a note about this particular webinar, it's one of 12 webinars that are sponsored by the Lutheran Community Foundation in 2013 as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. The LCF is committed to providing tools and resources to faith leaders and congregations to address issues surrounding domestic violence. So we're really glad that we can offer this webinar to you for free because of their sponsorship. So you can take a look at the lcf.org for more information on the work that they're doing. The graphic there on the left is a flyer of all 12 webinars that they're sponsoring this year, so I'll send that to you as well in the follow-up email. So thank you again to the Lutheran Community Foundation. So now on to the presentation. That's all for the beginning parts for me. I will pass it off now to Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. She is the founder and senior analyst here at Faith Trust Institute. She's a minister in the United Church of Christ and a graduate of Yale Divinity School. She's a pastor, educator, and author, as well as a practicing ethicist and theologian. Her books include Keeping the Faith, Guidance for Christian Women Facing Abuse, and Sexual Violence, The Sin Revisited. So Marie, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here today and to join with my colleague Kristen Leslie in this webinar. Kristen is the professor of Pastoral Counseling at Eden Seminary in St. Louis, and she comes to that position with an MDiv from Yale Divinity School and a Ph.D. from Claremont. But most importantly has been her work over the years in addressing issues of sexual violence and assault, and particularly her book, When Violence is No Stranger, Pastoral Counseling with Survivors of Acquaintance Rape, was a very important contribution to the field in 2003. She also has had now extensive experience in working with the military, and particularly with military chaplains, around the issues of sexual assault, and she'll be drawing on that experience as she presents with us today. What we are facing today is the issue of military sexual assault is currently before us, as most of you are probably aware. And would you go to that next slide? This is one of the many political cartoons that have emerged in recent weeks around this issue, but it reminds us that the military is now facing the issue of rape and has historically dealt with it in a don't ask, don't tell kind of mode. The reality is that women and men who serve in the military are victimized by their colleagues, and the high-profile hearings now in the U.S. Senate are finally bringing this forward, we hope, in a way in which there will be some substantive change. It's been discussed openly since at least 1991, and Kristen's going to review a little bit of that history with us. So now it's a hot political topic, but most importantly, it's a reality that lives on in the lives of our veterans who have been victimized, and particularly in issues of PTSD because of the sexual victimization that they've experienced. So we are assuming that you are here today because it's the current topic before us, and we want to provide an overview of the topic of sexual assault in the military to give you kind of the big picture. But particularly, Kristen is going to focus on the pastoral issues, and specifically, since she works with military chaplains, what some of those particular issues are for the chaplain as a potential resource to individuals in the military. But I think for all of us, inside or outside the military, it's helpful to have a kind of working knowledge of this issue, because even for those of you who may be serving in other settings of ministry, you are also dealing with veterans and their families, and these are some of the issues that those veterans are struggling with. So we welcome you to participate, and I'm going to turn it over now to Kristen, and we'll go from here.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks, Emily. Thank you all for joining today. As Marie said, we assume that if you are joining us today, it's either because you've been watching the Senate hearings on this, watching the news reports, or you and or a family member have been directly affected by this. And so we are glad that you're with us today, and we hope that this gives you some more information to work with. So I want to start with just talking about how we have known for a long time that rape is a tool of war. It's been used throughout history as a part, assumed to be a part of one of the tools of war. Actually, until 1993, women were prohibited from serving in some ways in the United States military, including as piloting aircrafts, because it was understood or believed that when they were captured, they would be tortured and raped. It was for that very reason that they wouldn't let women pilot. That changed in 1993 in part because the women came forward to say men and women do get raped in war. It's not just women. You can't use that as an excuse. But in those cases, we're talking about rape by the enemy, not rape by your battle buddy, not friendly fire. You'll hear us use that language. Not rape and assault by someone who's supposed to have your back, who's supposed to protect you. Today, what we're doing is thinking about what happens when assault and rape happens by someone who's supposed to be protecting you. So I want to start by looking at just a quick overview of what we want to do today. So Emily, if you can go to the next slide. This is what we're going to spend our time today. It's going to be just a brief overview. We'll start with a recent history of military sexual trauma, and you should know that the language of military sexual trauma comes out of the VA, most recently, to think about psychological and emotional impact of sexual harassment, sexual assault over a long term. So we'll look at some of the recent history. We'll quickly look at some working definitions. And then we're going to look at kind of how, in 2012, the Department of Defense came out with a pretty extensive survey that showed the high rates of assaults together with the low rates of reporting. And that's how they're beginning to name the problem, high rates of assault and low rates of reporting, what that does. I want to combine that then with thinking about what are some of the environmental issues contributing to the factor. What is it about the military environment that helps us understand some of those factors? Next, I want to think just briefly about kind of survivors' experiences, both kind of in general the survivors' experience of sexualized violence, but in particular military survivors. Next, I want to think about, it's important to think about the military context. What does this add to the conversation? And then in particular, since we're thinking about the pastoral work of the chaplain in the military, what are some of the things that we need to understand about the work of the chaplain that help us understand these larger matters? And then, if we have time, we're going to look at just general pastoral considerations. What's the role of the religious professional in working with someone who's a survivor? And then at the end of the slides, we've given you some resources to think about what you can take from here and go do some more work if you want to do that. So that's what we're going to spend our time doing. Marie, you want to add anything as we get going here?
No, I think that should keep us busy.
I think you're right. Okay. So in 2011, the Pentagon report found that 90% of military rapes are committed by men who have previous histories of assault. That's an astounding statistic. 90% of the assaults are by repeated offenders. That's not just a current matter, though. In our recent history, American history, we have seen sexual assault as happening regularly. You see in this slide just a brief history recounting what are some of the scandals, if you will, that related to sexualized violence. In 1991, we saw a lot of information around the Navy Tail Convention scandal. That's where in Las Vegas they had an annual, the Navy and Marines and the Air Force had a regular joining of folks, and there was all sorts of sexualized behavior, and 86 women and 15 men reported being sexually assaulted as a part of the routine matter what happened at this conference. Congress got involved, top brass got involved in that. 1996, at the Army training facilities at Fort Leonard and the Aberdeen Proving Ground, again, there was a whole issue that happened. It hit the press, again, it went to Congress, it went up the chain of command. 1997, the assault of Amy Sergeant Major Brenda Hoster. Similar response. Congress got involved, the Army brass got involved, and in each case, and you'll see, you see these and the other two, each time the military said, we will have zero tolerance for this behavior and we will change. Each time, each of the military branches, when it affected them, reevaluated what their procedures and protocols were and said, we have zero tolerance, now we think we have really attended to the problem. And yet we see, again, this recent history, it happened again and again. 2003, the Air Force Academy sexual assault scandal, where in their recent history, 142 reports of sexual assault, and part of the reality at the Air Force Academy is that these women and men came forward and reported it, and in most cases, they themselves were brought up on charges of either fraternizing, that is, younger cadets associating with older cadets, which is a no-no, and drinking infractions. They were found culpable for bad behavior, and so in many of those 142 cases, those folks, in fact, were disciplined and kicked out of the Air Force Academy. It was at the Air Force Academy how I entered into this conversation during that scandal, because they brought me in as a consultant to work with the chaplains to help them assess and improve the work that they did. So much as Marie indicated to you, my involvement in this conversation started in about 2003, and I've continued to do the work. And I want to share some insights that I have learned about this. And then lastly, 2012, it just came out. The Department of Defense came out with a report, and in a survey, a thorough survey, they found that 26,000 reports of unwanted sexual conduct and sexual assaults in the United States military. That's an increase of over 30% from 2010. That's a huge increase. What they found in that survey is that less than 1% of those were resulted in court-martial convictions. We see in the civilian world, but even more so in the military culture, that to get folks to report is very hard, in part because there's such a low rate of conviction or serious legal intervention when those reports happen. And so survivors find very little reason to report. Of those 26,000 reports, 3,374 were actual reported cases, in that those were the unrestricted reports. We'll get a little bit later to talk about the difference between restricted and unrestricted. But in this case, 3,374 folks, men and women, came forward and allowed their names to be used, allows procedures to go forward, and even then, less than 1% of those cases went to conviction or even court-martial at all. So you get a very quick sense that with the huge number of assaults that are happening, very, very few get into the courts. One of the conclusions that I draw from this, and I think that we in the civilian world can learn from it too, because the statistics are somewhat similar in the civilian world, that is, because of the low level of prosecution, when we work with survivors of sexualized violence, we have to help folks understand, and we ourselves, that healing cannot be tied to legal procedures and conviction. because the rates are so very low with any legal success at all. We need to find different ways to help survivors and thrivers to define and understand what it will mean for them to heal and to go forward. It's not just a legal matter. Marie, do you want to jump in on that at all?
Well, I would just add in terms of framing what you're describing as the reality is to realize that even though the rhetoric and the various branches for 20 years has been zero tolerance and, you know, we're going to take care of this, whatever it is, and this is a generalization because some people are working very hard on this, but I think we have to look at this and say whatever they're doing is not working. Right. Because the numbers continue to go up in terms of the actual assaults by predators. And I think one of the things that the Senate is now beginning to name in a very helpful way is that we have sexual predators within the military who are operating with virtual impunity. Now, that's a way, I think, then to begin to also focus our energies on what are we going to do about that, which then brings us back to the issues of low prosecution and consequences and so forth, which we may talk about in another webinar. But the point being that that's the institutional problem that we're facing. The impact then on the folks that Kristen is talking about of what does that do in terms of their healing process is the immediate concern from a pastoral perspective.
Right. Thank you for making that distinction. They really are two different things. There's the political conversation, and then there's the role of the pastor and the religious community about how do we engage that. We need to know the political issues, but we attend to folks in a pastoral way.
Yeah.
You see at the top of that slide, a target-rich environment. That's a quote from a retired brigadier general recognizing that because of exactly what Marie was just talking about, that without impunity, there's high access to targets, if you will. It's a target-rich environment. Emily, let's move forward. Next slide. So the report put out by the Department of Defense, and that report is linked at the end of this report, and you can also get access to it to the Faith Trust Institute if you're interested in looking at that Department of Defense report. But the conclusions are the high rates of sexual assault, and it's a significant increase in previous years, combined with low rates of reporting. And that's what you hear a lot in the Senate hearings right now, is those two combined things, which makes for a predatory environment. Next slide. So just quickly, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the standard by which the military follows, under Article 120, begins to address these things as rape, sexual assault, and other sexual misconduct. That's the language that they will use. The language of military sexual trauma is actually the language of the Veterans Administration, the Veterans Affairs, and clearly they work together. So when we talk about sexual assault, we're talking about any offense of a sexual nature committed without the lawful consent of a survivor of the victim. That includes rape, carnal knowledge, which I'm giving you a definition there, is sexual intercourse with a child under 16, forcible sodomy, and assaults with intent to commit these acts. So even if they don't act, even if they are not followed through, if there's an intent to, it counts. So this includes completed or attempted attacks involving unwanted sexual contact. This may involve physical force, or in the military, this becomes important, constructive force, that is threats, intimidation, and abuse of authority. If someone feels like their ability to survive in an environment will be significantly compromised if they don't engage in sexual behavior, that's considered a constructive force. May include grabbing, fondling, and verbal threats if the verbal threats constitute constructive force. And then I think it's important to understand, in Marie's earlier work, she has done a good job in helping us understand this, the whole notion of consent. The inability to give consent, that is, fully informed, freely chosen, and mutually agreed upon activity. If those three things don't exist, it is lack of consent. That's the piece that many people get confused around. Well, they didn't say no, can still be lack of consent. Marie, you want to jump in there?
Well, and again, just the context of an officer and an enlisted person, or a sergeant and a private, or whatever the relationship is, that clearly one person has power over the other, and so the not saying no is a function of being in a more vulnerable position.
Right, right. I do remember when I was at the Air Force Academy, one of the younger cadets said to me, ma'am, we can't say hell no to an officer.
Right.
To someone with more rank. It's not allowed.
Right, right.
So consent looks very different when you take power into consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next slide. So I just thought it was important to remember that the FBI ranks sexual assault as the second most violent crime behind only murder. So sexual assault is the most violent and traumatic crime that a victim, a survivor, will live to remember, which is just an important reminder that it's not, and you'll hear us talk about this again and again, this is not just bad sex. This is someone who's violated at a core level and whose whole life is changed because of it, how they engage the world. And so it has the ripple effect of the violence from sexualized violence is significant. Next slide. So the high rates of sexualized violence in the military, there are some contributing environmental factors, and I want to quickly go through those so we can begin to understand the wider picture within the military context. The first is demographic issues. So a combination of lower sociocultural power, that is, folks who are young, who are unmarried, who have less education, racial ethnic minorities, and so have less access to community resources, and live in close quarters. Those things, the lower sociocultural power, in combination with low organizational power, that is, low pay grade, fewer years of active duty, more layers of the chain of command above you, that is, authority figures to whom you have to respond. And then, in a sense, someone else who's thinking for them. That is, if you're lower down on the hierarchy scale, literally you're not supposed to be thinking for yourself. That's supposed to be the job of somebody else, as they say. When I was at the Air Force Academy during basic cadet training, one of the things that they were working with the cadets early on was to strip them of any individual sense of authority and autonomy and work toward building a unit identity. To the point of they even took people's watches and glasses away, and they gave people glasses back that all had the same frame. They had their own prescription, but the frame, so they all looked the same. So they were trying to get people to stop identifying as individuals and to identify as a member of the unit. When that happens, you begin to see yourself not as an individual, but as someone who's plugged into a unit. And in that unit, then, people are put in there into specific places in the hierarchy. If you are a lower power in the hierarchy, that is the lower organizational power, so lower sociocultural power plus lower organizational power, it leads to increased vulnerability to sexualized violence, to sexual assault, because of those demographics themselves. Okay, next slide. So we talked about the demographics. Secondly, we're talking about the cultural emphasis on violence. Some people will join the military because it's a way for them to engage, because they have a wider altruistic notion that they want to change the world. We'll get into this a little bit later. But there are some who engage in the military because of the violence itself. After World War II, studies have shown that they actually did a survey of how many people shot their guns, how many guns were shot after World War II, and they found that it was 10 to 15% of people actually used their guns in war. And the military decided that wasn't effective in order to get their mission completed. And so since World War II, they've changed the training routines for the military to desensitize people so that they will be more willing to go ahead and engage the tools of war to get their mission done. So because of the desensitization in training for purposes of fulfilling the mission, what that does is desensitize members of the military for a whole host of things. Folks who are working on moral injury have found that desensitization is one of the things that adds to moral injury. It's also one of the things that increases incidents of sexualized violence. Next slide. So, the military is a hyper-masculine, heteronormative gender norms it has. And what I'm talking about, kind of hyper-masculine, heteronormative, we're talking about very strict gender norms, which include power, which include not power sharing. And what that does is it separates this whole notion of there is a one kind of male role and a female role, and the male role is the one with the power. In a hypermasculine, heteronormative environment, gendered roles are very strict, and rigid sex roles are very strict. When that happens in that environment, group cohesion upholds rigid norms around sexuality and hypermasculinity. When that happens as well, women service members can lack a sense of community within the unit to get the support that they will want and what they will need in order to stave off violence, but also to support each other. Bree, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think we should move forward, and that's part of the problem. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Next slide. Substance abuse. In military academies, like most colleges and university campuses, a majority of sexual assault crises involve the use of alcohol. And it's a misnomer to think that alcohol takes away one's inhibitions. Alcohol increases violence in this case. So easy access to alcohol with newfound independence and peer pressure involved with, including then men and women living and working in close quarters, increases the ability of assaults in general. It's also important to remember, particularly during deployment, when the time is measured by, as they say, 10% terror, that should be 90% boredom, alcohol becomes a leveler in those environments. And so the use and abuse of alcohol is very high. That contributes to the rate of increase of sexualized violence. Next slide. Studies have shown high prevalence of prior sexual abuse, both perpetration and victimization of those who are in the military. The rates are, in fact, they find that double the rates found in the civilian population of both histories of perpetration and victimization. For some, the military is a place to escape or have a fresh start from past lives, past environments that were violent. And for some, the military is a place to release pent-up aggression or resentment. Put those two together, and you see a higher prevalence of prior sexual abuse. Next. So we talked about what are some of the contributing factors to why a higher rate. And I should say at the end of the study, you can see at the end of the slideshow, I'm pulling a lot of these statistics from research that has been done and compiled all the research. You can go and do some more look at these if you're interested. But so we talked about the environment, the environmental indicators of why there's such a high percentage or a higher percentage, but there's also lower rate of reporting. So why that is? One, confusion on how to report. Both because just it can be a chaotic environment, but also because the standards changed so regularly. In the 3 years that I was working at the Air Force Academy around sexualized violence, the standards for reporting changed about 4 times. So even the chaplains who chose to try to keep up on it were regularly confounded, really through no fault of their own, to try to figure out who to report, what's the chain of command, what are the avenues of reporting, and who can know. So in the system, it's very confusing. 2, commanding officers often encourage survivors not to report. Now, in some cases, that's because they know the system is going to work against a survivor. And so they're trying to protect the survivor. And in some cases, it's because they don't want to change the environment. So it's both for positive and negative reasons that commanding officers will encourage folks not to report. 3, reporting gives a perception that you will harm unit cohesion. Now you're going to hear later on in the slide presentation the language of unit cohesion, good order, and discipline are means to achieving the mission of the military. Unit cohesion and good order and discipline are basic elements to do that. So it can be perceived that if you report someone that you will harm unit cohesion. So in fact, the victims themselves get blamed for the breakup of the unit cohesion, where in fact we know that it's not they themselves who are doing that, but it's the assailant who did it. 4.
And Kristen, just
yeah.
on that one, I would add the thing that I never have understood about this concept, both in the military and frankly in the church where we address these issues, is the value of unit cohesion and good order and discipline is such a high value,
right,
that there doesn't seem to be an understanding that the sexual assault of one's peers within the unit is what destroys unit cohesion,
right,
not the reporting of the sexual assault.
right.
And it's sort of, why isn't that value come forward in terms of why it's so important to basically address anyone who would betray the trust of his or her comrades in arms in that setting, rather than wait until it happens and then punish the person who speaks up. I still don't understand why it works that way, but it does.
Right. And I think in some ways, both in the church and in the military, what it is doing, it's actually exposing a deeper issue around gender norms and expectations.
Right, which seem to override the value of unit cohesion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. 4, a trauma diagnosis is someone comes forward and reports that they have experienced sexualized violence and they're experiencing any kind of trauma. A diagnosis of any kind, or even just that in your file, can hurt someone's record. So it's seen as a ding on someone's record. Now, when I was working at the Air Force Academy, one of the things that we found was that people came forward only after they themselves had so spiraled down that they couldn't function in the environment, because they were trying to keep their record clean just in case they could pull themselves forward, because they knew once it went on their record, there was probably no returning from it. Mm-hmm. Even in a confidential record, those dings are huge. It's the same reason that a lot of people don't want to report, don't want to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury or not any of those kind of things. Once it goes on your file, you can be seen as unfit. Same with sexualized violence. You can be seen as unfit for duty through no fault of your own. The next one, for some folks, they have established coping mechanisms that allow them to keep the secret. So by telling someone, it feels like they change their own coping mechanisms and they have to develop new coping mechanisms. And an environment that's so pressurized to try to have to change your coping mechanisms can be hard and can feel threatening. So for some, in their own mind, they won't report because they feel like it disturbs the coping mechanisms that they've been able to kind of get themselves out of bed in the morning and keep going. The next one, fear of punishment for code infractions, because in some cases, sexualized violence has involved larger parts of the institution, which is engaging in your comrades, but also drinking and other behaviors. What we've seen over and again, when people report, they're held accountable for those other things, for other infractions. You see regularly in the news now when people bring a sexual, in the military, if someone brings sexual assault against someone in the military and they're brought up on charges of infidelity, and the sexual assault in itself is completely not talked about. It's all these other issues. So fear of punishment for other code infractions is a real lived issue, why people will not report. 7, and this is true military or not, fear that they won't be believed. And in many cases they won't. So why do you tell if you're not going to be believed? And then all these other things on this list come into place. And then the last one is questions about confidentiality. If I go tell the chaplain, if I go tell someone, who are you going to tell and how is it going to affect me? Because, and we'll get to this a little bit later, notions of privileged communication, confidentiality, differ in the military than they do in the civilian world. And they change some too. So folks don't want to report because they don't know who to tell and what's going to happen with the information when they tell. Marie, do you want to add anything to this list?
No, I think it's great, and we do need to move, so
okay.
Go ahead, Kristen.
Okay. So just a quick comment about lesbians, bi, gay, and transgender and racial ethnic minorities can have additional challenges that we need to name here, and that is they're less likely to be believed. They have negative experiences in reporting. They anticipate that they will be blamed for the violence done against them. They somehow asked for it. They can be more heavily scrutinized because of cultural myths about sexuality. And if the assailant is of their same community as the survivor, there will be a sense of betraying their own community. So they're asked to kind of side with their community over themselves. Okay, next slide. Men are the least likely to report, and we know, if you've seen the documentary, the marvelous documentary, The Invisible War, and if you've been looking at any of the statistics, you know that men are also assaulted. But men are the least likely to report, and that's because of shame and embarrassment. The fear of the label of being gay, the homosexual label, and stigmatization, and until very recently you would be discharged from it. And just as a general threat, you're threatened with being outed from it. And this is true for men who are gay and men who are not. The stigmatization is the same. In the military, there's this sense of show no fear. If you do, you're weak or cowardly, and that works against that heteronormative masculine narrative that is held as the standard. So you're not supposed to allow yourself to be overpowered. So if you are overpowered, it's your own fault, and somehow that dings the masculinity of the man. And then if you complain about it, that's seen as a weaker trait. So the question is, what's the outcome benefit? If I report, how's that going to help me? So the question even more so for men. And then there's a stereotype that, again, heteronormative masculine stereotype that men like sex, no matter what kind and in what form. Men like sex. And that absolutely can work against men telling if they have been assaulted. Okay, next slide. So, research has found over and again that confidentiality actually leads to better prevention, better intervention, and fewer incidents. And the way it works is when there is prompt, quality and confidential help that is provided, more people report, and in a shorter time frame will they report if they know that the source they're going to will be holding the things in confidence. When that happens, that leads directly to more prosecutions then, because there are more reports, and because of that, fewer incidents. So prevention and intervention are both served by good and confidential help. That becomes very important for both faith communities, but for the chaplains to recognize in your units, chaplains, you are often the ones that are the only ones that have privileged communication. In many cases, most of your colleagues have to report charges of sexual assault up the chain of command, and then the story no longer belongs to the survivor. It belongs to the unit. So the chaplain plays an incredibly crucial role in holding confidences. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. I think I'm going to let you read this one. This is the survivor's experience. Just quickly, issues of betrayal and loss of trust lead to separation from community and unit cohesion, again, which are seen as fundamental. Newness breeds fatigue. When you are a survivor, when you're having to operate in the world in a different way, you're just more tired. That's true for anyone in the civilian world as well. But in a pressurized environment, fatigue can be dangerous. Questioning of one's own intuition, it rattles someone's ability to concentrate, and that can be dangerous in a military environment. Issues of touch, who can touch, and physical touching becomes an issue, and in close quarters, that is a problem. Spatial needs are further compromised for someone who is a survivor. And then loss of future dreams. People join the military for a number of reasons, but typically it's because they are thinking about a future, what they can do, and who they can be. All that comes off the table for a survivor. Next slide. So I'm mindful that we're running out of time here, so I want to. So this might be the last slide we do, and I want to suggest to ask you to go ahead and look at the other slides. But important in the military environment to understand a couple things. You've heard me say good order and discipline, unit cohesion, and trust as basic building blocks. Whenever you're thinking about sexual assault in the military, these concepts have to come first and foremost when you're thinking about how do people engage, understand, and experience sexualized violence. It's always in terms of good order and discipline, unit cohesion, and trust as a building block. When Kristen Gillibrand in the Senate hearings was talking, really berating the chain of command, this is the language she used. Good order and discipline and unit cohesion are not being served by sexual assault. Important to recognize that chaplains and everybody else in the military fits into a chain of command, fits into a hierarchy. And when that happens, reports go up the chain of command in a very prescribed way. So for a survivor of sexualized violence, once their story is told, it goes up a chain of command unless it's in a restricted telling environment. And when that does, the story no longer belongs to the survivor, but other people are involved. That's one of the reasons why some folks will not report, because they don't want it to go up the chain of command. Vulnerability versus responsibility. In a military environment, there's a notion that you train out risk. That is, if we know what the risky environments are, the risky parts of the environment, we'll train you so that you can be safer in that environment. That's true about sexualized violence, in fact. The way the military is dealing with it now is that they're trying to train people on prevention and intervention. But what that does then is that people assume that now you've been trained, if it happens to you, you yourself are responsible for it now. So because of this military overlay of you can train out risk, folks who are sexually violated in the military are held accountable for being vulnerable. So you lose the distinction between vulnerability and responsibility.
And Kristen, let me just add on that, again, the obvious focus here is on victims. And if we can fix victims or train them not to be victims, which is all well and good, except it never addresses the real problem, which is the predator. And so the lack of focus on what are we doing about the people who are predatory and operating in this target-rich environment, I think is the missing piece of the discussion.
Right, absolutely. And then deployment considerations. Deployment, when you go into theater, when you are sent off to war, you deploy with the offender. So it's not the sense of you can separate from the person who has assaulted you. In many cases, in those cases where they're your chain of command, you still have to engage them regularly. You're still living with them. So you're deployed in dangerous situations with people with whom you have no trust and who have betrayed you. And so when rape and sexualized violence happen in the operational theater, in an already vulnerable environment, it means that the victims are that much more vulnerable and cannot rely on the unit to have their back. And then returning from a deployment, we hear the stories again and again. These are folks who were disillusioned. The survivors themselves are disillusioned by the military and come back changed, both by their military involvement, but then also this notion of they were supposed to be a part of the unit. They joined to make a difference, and now all that's changed is them. And they are devastated. So I'm mindful of the time, and I'm going to point you to the slides that just talk about some of the considerations for chaplains and the chaplain's goals, and then what's the pastoral care responses. There are some slides there that you can take a look at, and I will encourage you to do that. Marie, is there a way that we can wrap this up as we get into some questions?
Yeah, I just want to make one observation. Again, as we collectively frame this problem and understand kind of the institutional realities that people are struggling with, I've done work also with military chaplains over the years and served on the Defense Task Force on Domestic Violence with the Department of Defense in the early 2000s to, again, help the DoD figure out what to do about domestic violence. And I had a lot of opportunity there and learned a lot from my interaction with commanders and with DoD. And the thing that I just still find ironic is the military is obviously a highly structured, hierarchical institution by necessity in terms of the tasks that it has. And basically what we saw as we were talking about domestic violence was that if people wanted to get something done, they had the mechanism to do it in ways that the civilian world doesn't have nearly so much. And so I think there's a bottom line issue here in addressing military sexual violence, that if there really is a decision that the agenda is to stop this, and so that it becomes a rare occurrence rather than a common occurrence, that as an institution the military has the means to do this. Right. Because they can take action and they can remove people who are predatory and dangerous to good order and discipline and unit cohesion and so forth and so on. So I think that's really where the rubber hits the road at this point in terms of the institution coming to terms with, are we serious about this? Do we really have the agenda that we really want to stop this? And I know that there are people in the military who do and are very sincere and very eager to find ways to do that. But I think we've got to be clear that that's what's really at stake here. And up until this point, even though for 20 years this has been on the table, I think that some have been serious, but as an institution, they really haven't used the resources that they have of that structure to address this problem. And so that potential is there and in ways that we really don't have on the civilian side. So one of the questions we have, Kristen, is from one of our colleagues who is a military chaplain in the reserves, and is very concerned and has had a lot of training now on the issues, and is working with her commanders who are also very committed to this, which is great to hear, and I'm glad that you have that support for your concern as well. But her question is, from her commanders, as they're all talking about this, is what can they do and how do they work together to really make a difference and address this? And again, it's kind of that bigger question that we're looking at. I will say, and then Kristen, what your particular take is on this kind of what can be done question. I think that the missing piece right now, and it's coming out in the Senate hearings, is prosecution and action against predators who are part of the military. a 1% conviction rate. I mean, those figures at the beginning, Kristen, that you gave us is just outrageous. I mean, it basically says that people who are predatory and literally preying on others within the military know that they can do that without any consequences. And as long as they know that, they're going to keep doing it. That's what they do. So I think in terms of the institutional response, the biggest piece of this is going to make the biggest impact is increased prosecution and separating people from the military who literally are a threat to unit cohesion and to the well-being of their comrades. And until that piece starts to turn, I think those of you who are as chaplains and therapists and so forth working with victims, all you're going to be doing is picking up the pieces. And thank goodness you're there to do that. But we've got to move beyond picking up the pieces to going up the river and figuring out why the bodies are coming down. And I think that's one of the critical things. And your commanders that you're working with, as far as I'm concerned, my experience in talking with commanders is the more commanders are on board with each other and support each other in taking action, the more likelihood then that the system begins to take this seriously. But Kristen, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I want to speak particularly to the role of a chaplain in that.
Right.
The concept of by your presence, the moral concept, chaplains have always known that there's the sense that because chaplains advise the command structure, no matter what their own place in the hierarchy is, chaplains advise the command structure. And so the system gives chaplains more voice to be prophetic in that environment. So by your presence, part of the role of the chaplain is to not forget the issue, because culturally we want to bump this issue off the table because we are so damn uncomfortable with it. Part of the role of the chaplains by your presence is not to let it get bumped off the table. To make sure that this is a matter of justice and moral training, that it stays, and so that people will be uncomfortable with the chaplain when these kind of situations happen, because the chaplain is around. By your presence, make sure that you are a presence around this. That's being prophetic. To be in pastoral care, when injury happens because of systemic oppression, and this is clearly, the statistics show it's systemic, by your presence says you are prophetic in it, and that you're not just going to let the system be that way. So even just by your presence around it, I think is really important in your advising the command structure.
And I think the other thing you point to there, Kristen, is the role of the chaplain is a chaplain to the commanders.
Right.
And to support those people as they are struggling to figure out, what do we do about this? And if they do come to you for counsel, it is a remarkable opportunity to help them deal with their internal moral struggle about what's the best thing to do and so forth. It's really a pretty special role that you have and the place that you are in that system.
Absolutely. Do we want to go to another question, or?
Looks like we don't have anything currently. Please, if you have any question, send it over to us. But Kristen, as you think about the work that you've done in this area, what have you seen over the 10 years that you've been intimately involved in it, and what do you anticipate now going forward?
Well, one of the things that I had experienced kind of at the public level is recognizing that, and this is true of any system, when there's pressure from the outside world on a system, it will work to change. Right now, with the pressure from the Senate and from the wonderful documentary film, The Invisible War, members of the military are setting up and having to think about this and make some decisions. Once the public pressure is off, there is less need, because something else is causing pressure, to make these changes. In 2003, when I was working with the Air Force Academy, one of the things that they were very clear about is that there was a time frame for things to be able to for some change protocols to happen, because there was outside pressure, outside people looking in. when in those times, and I think this is true for faith communities as well, when there is the outside conversation, there's a time to be had to begin to get some work being done there. So take advantage of those times. Don't rue those times so there's public focus, but recognize that's a fertile and productive time to get things done. But also recognize when the public pressure is gone, part of our pastoral responsibilities is to continue to do the work. You know, the Faith Trust Institute is the perfect example of that. They're the folks who are always doing the work, and then when these big public events come up, you are the folks for folks to come in and out of, because you are the experts, and that's the beauty of the Faith Trust Institute because of the solid work that has been done for so long.
I think you're right in terms of taking advantage of those windows when they do open. We do have a question here that I think is really good. I teach undergraduate female cadets who wish to be military chaplains. What should I emphasize in working with them?
Part of it is recognizing that one of the things that I've experienced working with military chaplains is that folks will more likely come and tell this story to a woman chaplain than they will to a man chaplain. And so it does mean there's an expectation that women who want to be chaplains need more training around this stuff to be more prepared. I think men and women need to know the information. But because of cultural notions of who you tell about sexual issues, more men and women will come to women chaplains. So I think one of the things for you who are working with your women who want to be chaplains, recognize this is something they're going to need to learn. How do you work with survivors? How do you work with the chain of command around this? This does become part of your work.
And the other thing, just to go back to one of your demographic facts, is to realize, and this is true as far as I'm concerned for anybody in ministry, but to realize how frequent sexual abuse in childhood and young adulthood is already before you even encounter this situation. So the need to train chaplains, to train anyone who's going into ministry around issues of sexual assault and abuse is critical, because it's such a common reality that then maybe manifests in other situations that you're trying to deal with pastorally.
Right.
One comment we have here, the importance of chaplains understanding how to respond appropriately to victims, absolutely, with non-shaming, validating, helping people to frame their experience and to understand what their experience has been of violence. If you've seen the film The Invisible War, one of the women survivors in that piece is struggling with feeling like that because of the assault, she's no longer a virgin sexually, and that was a big issue for her and a big concern for her. And so as I was listening to her, I was thinking about now what would a chaplain be able to help her with in her struggle around that issue. And in the film, we hear her father end up being the person who clarifies for her that, no, your virginity and your sense of wholeness and as who you are as a woman is not affected by the fact that you have been assaulted. This is assault. It's not about sex. It's about assault. And so those are some of the I think, important ways that chaplain, again, has the opportunity to engage with someone who's been assaulted around what does this mean for them, right, both emotionally and spiritually. Anything else, Kristen, you'd like to sum up with? Can you say anything about the work that you're going to be doing on these issues?
I'm working with the Navy right now in coming up with some training curriculum to train their chaplains. And so the Navy and the other branches are taking this quite seriously. And there are folks who at top levels who are very committed to making their military battle ready. And we may not like that language as civilians, but what that means is that it's a safe enough environment where people can actually get the mission done. So they recognize that it works against them to not have a good, safe environment. And so there are folks at the top levels who are taking this quite seriously. And I applaud them for doing that work.
Yes, hopefully this is one of those windows where some real change now can occur, because a lot of people are paying attention and looking at this. And so we're going to conclude. We appreciate those of you who joined us for the conversation, and hope that we've expanded your understanding of the issue so that you are also voices in your communities to help people understand what this is about and why it is important, and why those of us, particularly on the civilian side, need to be aware and involved in the conversation, and supportive, as Kristen was saying, of those of you who are on the military side, doing everything you can to move this whole issue forward. So we appreciate your involvement in that. I'll turn it back now to Emily to conclude.
Great. Thank you to both of you. I'm just going to skip ahead quickly to the resource slide, put that up here for a moment, just to point your attention to that slide. Some additional resources and links there. And like I said in the beginning, I'll be sending out this PowerPoint to you this afternoon, so you can go and click on all those links and have those available to you. Also, as I said in the beginning, we recorded this webinar, and so if there was someone that you know who would benefit from this, you can point them to our website. It should be up there next week. When you close down the webinar today, there'll be a screen that pops up that is an opportunity for you to provide us with feedback on your experience today with the webinar. If you have any further comments or questions, that's a good place to put them, or ideas for us for future webinars. That's a good place to put them as well. You can visit our website, faithtrustinstitute.org, to see some upcoming training and webinar opportunities, and also online training. This concludes today's presentation. Thanks again to Kristen and Marie for joining us today for the presentation.